In the humid command bunkers of Rabaul, the sound of laughter echoed through concrete corridors in the summer of 1943. Japanese officers, their uniforms crisp despite the tropical heat, gathered around radio sets crackling with intelligence reports. The Americans, they heard, were planning something audacious, something so foolish it bordered on comedy. "Island hopping," one commander chuckled, the phrase rolling off his tongue like a child's game. Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto, veteran of the China campaigns, shook his head in disbelief as he studied the intercepted American communications. "They think they can simply leap over our fortresses like stones across a pond." The room erupted in knowing smiles. These were men who had witnessed the fall of Singapore, who had seen European empires crumble before the rising sun. In their minds, the Pacific had become Japan's private lake, dotted with unsinkable islands that bristled with guns and sworn defenders. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, commander of the 8th Area Army, raised his sake cup in mock salute. "Let them come to our doorstep," he declared, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never tasted defeat. "Each island will be their grave." But beneath the polished floors of that command center, a different reality was taking shape. In dusty file cabinets, supply reports painted a troubling picture. Rice shipments delayed, ammunition requests unfulfilled, reinforcements promised but never arriving. The empire's reach had grown so vast that its own arteries were beginning to constrict. Private Hiroshi Tanaka, barely 18 and stationed on the coral fortress of Betio, wrote to his sister that same week, "The officers tell us the Americans fear our guns. They say we are invincible here." His letter would never reach home. The postal ship carrying it would be at the bottom of the Pacific within days, victim of a submarine that shouldn't have been able to penetrate so deep into Japanese waters. As radio operators continued monitoring American transmissions, translating words like bypass and isolation, the laughter in those bunkers began to sound different, hollow, like echoes in an empty tomb. The seeds of catastrophe were already sprouting in the humid soil of overconfidence, though none of the laughing officers could see them yet. The transformation had begun 2 years earlier, when Japanese engineers first set foot on specks of coral that barely rose above the Pacific swells. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, names that meant nothing to most of the world would soon be written in blood and concrete. On Tarawa's Betio islet, barely 3 miles long and half a mile wide, Lieutenant Colonel Keiji Shibasaki commanded a fortress that defied nature itself. Where once only coconut palms and seabirds existed, now stood a maze of reinforced bunkers connected by tunnels that honeyed the coral bedrock. Machine gun nests were carved into positions that could sweep every inch of beach, their fields of fire overlapping like deadly spiderwebs. The construction had been backbreaking work. Korean laborers, conscripted and shipped across thousands of miles of ocean, had died by the hundreds mixing concrete in the tropical heat. Japanese engineers had studied every tide chart, mapped every reef, calculated every angle of approach an enemy might take. Nothing was left to chance. 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years, Shibasaki boasted to his aide, standing atop a gun emplacement that housed a massive 8-inch naval rifle. The weapon had been salvaged from a battleship and dragged by human chains across the coral, its barrel now trained on the horizon where American ships might one day appear. The myth of invincibility wasn't built on concrete alone. It was forged in the minds of men who had never known defeat. Propaganda films showed Japanese soldiers training in brutal conditions, bayoneting straw dummies with mechanical precision. Radio broadcasts promised that any American foolish enough to attempt a landing would face defenders who preferred death to dishonor. Sergeant Tadao Onuki, a machine gunner on Kwajalein, wrote in his diary, "We have turned this atoll into a steel fist rising from the sea. The Americans' soft marines will break against our rocks like waves." His confidence wasn't misplaced. The defenses were genuinely formidable, engineered by some of the finest military minds in the Japanese Empire. But isolation breeds delusion. Supply ships arrived less frequently now. their schedules disrupted by submarine attacks that headquarters dismissed as minor inconveniences. When ammunition ran low, officers assured their men that Japanese superiority would compensate for any material shortages. When food rations were cut, they spoke of the spiritual strength that would sustain true warriors. On distant Rabaul, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto studied intelligence reports with growing unease. The American industrial machine was producing ships and planes at a rate that seemed impossible, almost supernatural. But even Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and Japan's most strategic mind, couldn't foresee what was coming. The Americans weren't just building a navy, they were preparing to rewrite the rules of Pacific warfare entirely. The fortress islands stood ready, their guns loaded, their defenders prepared to die. But death, they would soon learn, could arrive in forms they had never imagined. Halfway across the Pacific, in a cramped planning room aboard the USS Indianapolis, Admiral Chester Nimitz spread a chart across a metal table. The vast blue expanse was dotted with tiny specks, islands that most Americans couldn't pronounce, atolls that didn't appear on civilian maps. Each dot represented a potential graveyard for thousands of young men. "We cannot assault every fortress," Nimitz said quietly, his finger tracing supply lines that stretched like spider silk across the ocean. "We don't have the ships, we don't have the time, and we certainly don't have the lives to spare." The strategy sessions had grown heated. General Douglas MacArthur, his ego as large as his tactical brilliance, insisted that every Japanese stronghold must be crushed through direct assault. "We will meet them strength against strength," he declared from his headquarters in Australia. "American courage will prevail over Japanese fanaticism." But Lieutenant Colonel Pete Ellis, a Marine intelligence officer whose gaunt face bore the marks of sleepless nights, had studied the problem from every angle. His calculations were brutal in their simplicity. If America attempted to storm every fortified island, the casualty rates would be astronomical. The Japanese were prepared to die. The question was whether America was prepared to watch an entire generation disappear into coral graves. "Island hopping," Ellis explained to a room full of skeptical admirals, "isn't about avoiding fights. It's about choosing which fights matter." His voice carried the weight of a man who had seen too many battle plans stained with blood before they ever left the planning table. The concept was revolutionary and terrifying in equal measure. American forces would leapfrog past heavily defended islands, seizing only those positions necessary for airfields and naval bases. The bypassed garrisons would be left, to wither on the vine, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, slowly starving while the war moved past them like a tide. Captain Ray Spruance, who would later command the Fifth Fleet, understood the psychological warfare involved. "We're not just isolating their bodies," he observed during one planning session. "We're isolating their purpose. A soldier can face death, but can he face irrelevance?" The debates raged through humid tropical nights. Maps were redrawn, casualty estimates recalculated, supply lines traced and retraced. Young staff officers, many fresh from American colleges, found themselves planning operations that would determine the fate of civilizations. Marine Private First Class Robert Sherrod, who would witness the coming battles, wrote to his girlfriend, "They're sending us to places that don't exist on any map my father ever saw. The officers say we're making history, but all I can think about is whether I'll live to read about it." The gamble was set. American shipyards worked around the clock, producing vessels at a rate that defied belief. Training camps from California to North Carolina churned out Marines and soldiers who learned to fight on beaches they'd never seen, preparing for battles against an enemy they'd been taught to fear and respect. The dice were about to be thrown across the Pacific, and no one, not in Washington, not in Tokyo, could predict where they would land. November 20th, 1943. Dawn broke over Tarawa like a funeral shroud, the sky stained crimson as if nature itself anticipated the carnage to come. The first test of America's island-hopping strategy was about to begin on a speck of coral so small it couldn't support a single tree. Aboard the transport ships, Marines checked their weapons one final time. Many were teenagers from farms in Iowa and factories in Detroit, men who had never seen an ocean before enlisting. Now they prepared to storm a fortress that Japanese propaganda claimed was impregnable. The naval bombardment began at 0600 hours. 16-inch guns from American battleships hurled shells the size of automobiles onto Betio Islet. The thunder was so intense that it could be heard from 50 miles away. For 3 hours, the coral fortress disappeared beneath eruptions of smoke and flame. "Nothing could survive that," whispered Corporal James Day, watching the island burn from the deck of his landing craft. But as the smoke cleared, the machine guns began to speak. Lieutenant Colonel Shibasaki's boast about 1 million men wasn't mere propaganda. His defenders had built their positions to withstand the apocalypse. When the first wave of Marines hit the beach, Japanese gunners emerged from undamaged bunkers like vengeful ghosts. The coral reef, which American planners had underestimated, trapped landing craft in killing zones where every movement drew concentrated fire. Sergeant John Spillane of the 3rd Battalion later recalled, "The water turned red around our boat. Men I'd trained with for months just disappeared. The Japanese weren't shooting at us, they were methodically erasing us." For 76 hours, the battle raged across an area smaller than most city parks. Marines crawled across coral that shredded their uniforms and skin, fighting for every pillbox, every bunker, every yard of blood-soaked sand. Japanese defenders fought with the mechanical precision of men who had already accepted death. Their last radio transmission, a simple message: "We will fight to the end." When silence finally fell over Tarawa, the statistics told a story that shook both nations. Of the 4,800 Japanese defenders, only 17 survived to be captured, many of them Korean laborers who had never wanted to fight. American casualties exceeded 3,000 in just 3 days, a rate of loss that would have been unsustainable if applied across the entire Pacific. But something else had been proven on those blood-stained reefs. The fortress that was supposed to be impregnable had fallen. The myth of Japanese invincibility was cracking like coral under bombardment. More importantly, American strategists now understood the true cost of their gamble and began to calculate how to avoid paying it again. The first test of island hopping had been written in blood, but it had passed. The question now was whether the Japanese High Command would learn the lesson or continue laughing until their armies vanished entirely. By the spring of 1944, something extraordinary was happening across the Pacific, though few realized it at the time. In the pre-dawn darkness of bypassed islands, Japanese sentries strained their eyes toward horizons that remained stubbornly empty. The supply ships that had once arrived with clockwork regularity had simply stopped coming. On Rabaul, once the mighty fortress that anchored Japan's entire southwest Pacific defense, Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura stood in his command bunker staring at a map that told an impossible story. Red pins marked American positions that seemed to materialize from thin air: Hollandia, Itape, Saipan, while his own forces remained frozen in place, watching history move past them like a distant storm. "Where are the Americans?" demanded Colonel Matsuda, intelligence officer for the 8th Army. The question hung in the humid air like incense in a temple. They could hear the distant rumble of aircraft engines, could intercept radio chatter from American operations, but their own forces might as well have been on the moon. The island hopping strategy wasn't just bypassing Japanese strongholds, it was erasing them from relevance. Private Kenji Nakamura, stationed on Truk, once called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, wrote increasingly desperate letters to his family in Hiroshima. "The ships no longer come," his final letter read. "We have rice for 2 weeks, ammunition for less. The Americans do not attack us. They do not need to. We are becoming ghosts." The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese military doctrine had prepared soldiers to die gloriously in battle, to achieve honor through sacrifice. But there was no honor in slowly starving while the war moved elsewhere. These were proud warriors reduced to scavenging for coconuts and fishing with improvised spears. On Wewak, Major Yoshio Yamada commanded 35,000 men who had been transformed overnight from an elite fighting force into irrelevant spectators. His diary entries, discovered decades later, paint a haunting picture. Day 127 since last supply drop. The men ask when we will fight. I have no answer. We are the forgotten army of a forgotten war. The Americans hadn't just isolated these garrisons physically, they had severed them from purpose itself. Radio broadcasts from Tokyo spoke of glorious victories in other sectors, but made no mention of the bypassed forces. It was as if 100,000 Japanese soldiers had simply evaporated. Dr. Toshio Nishi, a medical officer on Peleliu, documented the slow dissolution of military discipline. The men no longer maintain their weapons properly, he wrote. What is the purpose of cleaning a rifle that will never fire in anger? They stare at the sea and ask if the emperor remembers their names. Some garrisons attempted to break out, launching desperate raids against Allied positions with whatever supplies they could muster. These attacks were not strategic. They were acts of desperation by men who preferred death to irrelevance. Most failed before they began, planned by officers whose maps were months out of date and whose intelligence came from wishful thinking. The most chilling aspect was the silence from Japanese high command. Admiral Yamamoto was dead, shot down by American fighters who had intercepted his exact flight plan. The officers who replaced him were fighting their own battles for resources and relevance. The bypassed garrisons had become expendable, their sacrifice acceptable if it meant preserving forces for more critical battles. By late 1944, entire Japanese armies had effectively vanished from the war without firing a shot. They continued to exist, manning positions, following routines, waiting for orders that would never come. But they had been erased from strategic calculations, ghosts haunting islands that no longer mattered to either side. The laughter in those command bunkers had died away, replaced by a silence more terrifying than any bombardment. The breaking point came not with explosions or gunfire, but with whispers that spread through jungle positions like malaria. On Bougainville, Sergeant Major Ichiro Tanaka, a veteran who had served the emperor since the invasion of Manchuria, sat in his bunker reading a letter that would never be sent. "Honorable Father," he had written, then crossed out the words. How could he explain that honor had become meaningless when no one remembered you existed? The psychological warfare was more devastating than any bombing campaign. These men had been raised on stories of samurai loyalty, taught that dying for the emperor was the highest calling a Japanese soul could achieve. But what meaning did sacrifice hold when it occurred in absolute obscurity? Private Hiroshi Matsui, barely 19 and marooned on Kavieng, made his final diary entry in August 1944. Today marks 6 months since we saw a friendly ship. Lieutenant Yamada says we must maintain discipline, but half the men have stopped saluting. They say the war has forgotten us. I think they are right. The empire that had demanded absolute devotion had abandoned its most faithful servants. Supply drops ceased not because of American interdiction, but because Japanese logistics officers had simply removed the bypassed garrisons from their calculations. These islands no longer existed on operational maps in Tokyo. Medical officer Captain Nobuo Fujita documented the collapse of military structure on Manus Island. The men have formed fishing groups, he wrote. They trade military decorations for coconuts with local natives. Yesterday I saw Corporal Sato, who once swore to die for the homeland, teaching children to carve toys from spent ammunition casings. Some chose the final path their culture had prepared them for. On Wolei Atoll, an entire company committed ritual suicide rather than face the shame of slow starvation. They left a note. We die as soldiers, not as forgotten men. But even their sacrifice went unrecorded, unmarked by any monument or memory. Others simply walked into the jungle and disappeared. Not in dramatic last stands or heroic charges, but quietly, individually, like exhausted animals seeking solitude to die. Their bones would remain scattered across islands that tourism brochures would later describe as tropical paradises. The Empire's promise of eternal glory had curdled into a bitter reality. Some sacrifices were too small to matter, some devotion too inconvenient to acknowledge. The laughing officers of 1943 had become silent ghosts by 1944, victims of a strategy they had mocked until it erased them entirely. While forgotten armies withered in tropical exile, the American advance thundered forward with mechanical precision. Saipan fell in July 1944, its capture bringing B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese mainland. Guam was retaken after 21 days of savage fighting, erasing 3 years of Japanese occupation in less than a month. The contrast was staggering. On active battlefields, American Marines and soldiers fought with equipment that seemed to materialize from thin air: flame tanks, amphibious vehicles, close air support that arrived on schedule like deadly clockwork. Meanwhile, on bypassed islands just hundreds of miles away, Japanese defenders counted individual rifle rounds like precious gems. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, understood the psychological dimension of their success. "We're not just winning battles," he told his staff officers. "We're demonstrating that Japanese strategy was built on foundations of sand." The speed of American operations left even their own forces breathless. Tinian was secured in 8 days. Hollandia fell so quickly that Japanese defenders were still waiting for orders when American flags were raised over their headquarters. Each victory proved that the island-hopping concept wasn't just working, it was revolutionizing Pacific warfare. But the triumph carried a haunting undertone. Intelligence officers began compiling lists of bypassed garrisons, calculating the numbers of Japanese soldiers who were simply disappearing from the war without formal surrender or decisive battle. By conservative estimates, over 200,000 enemy troops had been effectively neutralized without being defeated. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Sherrod, the war correspondent, captured the eerie reality in his dispatches. "We pass islands where we can see Japanese positions with binoculars, but we might as well be looking at archaeological ruins. They're already ancient history." The human cost of this ghostly warfare was difficult to calculate. American casualties dropped dramatically as the strategy matured, but somewhere in the bypassed islands, Japanese soldiers were dying at rates that would never appear in any official statistics. Starvation, disease, and despair were claiming more lives than any American assault. Victory parades in liberated territories celebrated conquests that felt almost anticlimactic. Cities that had been enemy strongholds were simply empty. The defenders hadn't been killed in glorious battle. They had been erased by irrelevance, abandoned by their own command structure, forgotten by history itself. The thunder of American success echoed across the Pacific, but beneath it ran a quieter sound, the whisper of armies that had vanished into silence, leaving behind only the rustling of wind through abandoned positions. 79 years have passed since the laughter died in those concrete bunkers, but the Pacific keeps giving up its secrets. In 2019, a team of marine archaeologists diving near Truk Lagoon discovered a Japanese radio post, still perfectly preserved in the coral depths. The final message, never sent, remained visible on the operator's notepad. "Is anyone still listening?" Today, hikers on Peleliu stumble across rusted helmets and ammunition clips scattered through jungle undergrowth that has reclaimed what was once a fortress. These islands have become inadvertent memorials to a peculiar form of warfare: victory through abandonment, conquest through forgetting. The families in Japan never received closure. Unlike soldiers who died in documented battles, the men who vanished on bypassed islands simply disappeared from all records. The Japanese government, overwhelmed by more pressing defeats, never compiled comprehensive lists of the forgotten garrisons. Mothers waited for letters that could never be written from islands that no longer existed in military calculations. American veterans who later visited these sites describe an unsettling experience. They find no monuments to their victory, no evidence of the grand strategy that won the Pacific War. Instead, they discover silence, positions that were never stormed, defenses that were never tested, soldiers who died without ever engaging their enemy. The island-hopping strategy became a template for modern warfare, studied in military academies around the world. But its most profound lesson was psychological, that the fear of irrelevance could be more devastating than the fear of death. Japanese commanders who had mocked American weakness discovered that their strength meant nothing when deployed against an enemy who refused to acknowledge it. The ghosts of those vanished armies still inhabit coral atolls across the Pacific. Their bones rest beneath tourist resorts and nature preserves, unmarked and unremembered. The empire that demanded their absolute loyalty erased them from history as thoroughly as American strategy erased them from relevance. The laughter that once echoed through command bunkers has been replaced by something far more unsettling. The sound of wind through empty positions, carrying voices that no one alive remembers, speaking words that no one living can understand. Some victories, it seems, are won not by fighting but by forgetting.